Do you remember those clothes? The ones you wore when money was tight but pride still fit just right? In the 1960s, patched jeans, hand-sewn dresses, and worn shoes carried families through long days and harder times. Looking back now, how did something so simple manage to mean so much? Patched blue jeans were the badge of hard work and survival for anyone who grew up without much in the 1960s. Denim was tough, built to last through years of use, but when money was tight, even the toughest pair had to be stretched further. You wore them until the knees wore through and the threads started to fray. Then your mother or grandmother would sit at the table and bring them back to life with a patch or two. Every pair told a story. Stains from the factory floor, a tear from climbing a fence, a mark from a fall that left a scar to match. These jeans were more than clothing. They were proof that nothing went to waste in a poor household. The patches themselves became a kind of art, stitched from whatever scrap fabric was available, floral prints, corduroy squares, or pieces cut from other worn-out jeans. You could spot a family's creativity in those patches. They were bright, personal, and stubbornly proud. No one called it fashion back then, but it was an unspoken uniform of endurance. When the world around you expected everything to be shiny and new, patched jeans said you were practical, grounded, and still standing tall. They might not have looked store-bought, but they fit your life perfectly, every stitch holding together a little bit of history. Hand-sewn cotton dresses were the quiet heart of everyday life for working women in the 1960s. Store-bought clothing was a luxury, and most mothers didn't have the extra dollars to spend on fashion when there were mouths to feed. So, fabric stores and sewing patterns became lifelines. At the kitchen table, under the warm buzz of a single lamp, women cut, pinned, and stitched dresses that would last all year. The dresses were simple, A-line, floral, maybe with a pocket or two, made from durable cotton that could handle scrubbing and sunlight alike. Sometimes they were made from flour sacks, sometimes from leftover fabric or curtains, whatever could be found cheap or free. The magic wasn't in the material, it was in the hands that made it. Each dress was measured with care, adjusted with love, and patched when time took its toll. They weren't glamorous, but they were personal. Proof that skill and heart could outshine money. A hand-sewn dress meant your mother's time, her effort, and her patience stitched into every seam, something no store could sell. And when Sunday came, you wore it proudly. Not because it was perfect, but because it was yours. Hand-me-down school clothes were the great equalizer for poor kids growing up in the 1960s. Everyone wore them, whether they admitted it or not. Clothes rarely came new. They came from older siblings, cousins, or neighbors who had already grown out of them. You could tell the story of a whole family by a single sweater that passed through 3 children before it finally unraveled. The hems were let out, the buttons replaced, and the sleeves might have been a little too short, but they kept you warm and decent. Wearing someone else's old clothes wasn't a shame. It was survival, and it taught you gratitude early. Mothers became experts at small miracles, turning one pair of pants into 2, or shortening dresses so another daughter could wear them. Kids sometimes teased each other, but deep down, everyone knew they'd be wearing the same clothes next year. The smell of laundry soap and starch clung to those hand-me-downs like a reminder of home, clean, cared for, and practical. Every scuff on a shoe or faded spot on a collar carried the memory of someone who wore it first. You might not have had the newest styles, but you learned to take pride in keeping what you had neat and strong. Feed sack shirts and skirts were born out of pure necessity and became a symbol of creativity in the 1960s poorer homes. Back then, feed and flour sacks weren't just packaging, they were opportunity. Companies even began printing the sacks in floral or checkered designs because they knew housewives would reuse them for clothing. If you were poor, you didn't waste a thing, and those sacks became the backbone of wardrobes across rural America. The fabric was sturdy, washable, and free, and that made it gold. Mothers cut and sewed shirts, skirts, and even little girl dresses out of the patterned cloth, sometimes piecing together mismatched prints in ways that looked almost artistic. What started as thrift became its own kind of style, a quiet rebellion against waste and a nod to ingenuity. Even as television filled with ads for department store fashion, people in small towns proudly wore their feed sack creations. Each one was unique, hand-sewn and built to last through hard work, chores, and long summers. Feed sack clothing wasn't just fabric, it was proof that even the poorest families could make beauty out of what others threw away. Homemade knit sweaters were the warmth of the working-class household in the 1960s. Yarn was cheaper than a store-bought coat, and many mothers and grandmothers spent evenings knitting by hand to keep their families dressed. Every stitch was made with patience, and every mistake became part of the sweater's charm. They came in plain colors or mismatched stripes, sometimes with sleeves that didn't quite match, but nobody cared. They were warm, soft, and made with love. Children wore them to school and to church, the wool sometimes itching against their necks, but they didn't complain. You wore that sweater until it stretched, then you wore it again. When holes appeared, they were darned, and when they outgrew you, they went to someone smaller. These sweaters were more than clothing. They were comfort stitched into form. To wear one was to be wrapped in your mother's care, a small shield against the cold world outside. Men's work overalls were the uniform of survival in the 1960s for fathers, sons, and grandfathers alike. Whether you worked in a field, a factory, or a small-town garage, overalls were built for one thing: endurance. They were thick, denim or canvas, with pockets deep enough for tools and hands calloused from labor. They smelled of oil, dust, and honest sweat, the scent of hard work that never left no matter how many times they were washed. Every rip told a story: a nail snag on a construction site, a tear from climbing a fence, or a patch your wife stitched after supper to make sure you had something to wear in the morning. When you slipped them on, you weren't dressing up. You were gearing up, ready to face another long day. The knees wore thin, the straps faded, but the man inside them stood proud. For working men, overalls were both armor and identity, proof that your worth wasn't in your paycheck, but in the work your hands could do. Homemade aprons were the unsung heroes of the 1960s kitchen. Every mother had one, sometimes two, if she was lucky. They were sewn from leftover fabric scraps, old curtains, or worn-out dresses, stitched together into something that worked harder than anything else she owned. The apron saw it all: spilled coffee, splattered gravy, flour clouds, and sticky fingers tugging at the hem. It was more than fabric. It was a shield, the barrier between chaos and care. The pocket carried everything: recipe cards, clothespins, or sometimes a handkerchief to wipe a child's face. And when it frayed or tore, it wasn't thrown away. It was patched again and again, proof that love never stopped working. It was part protection, part practicality, and part pride. A clean apron meant a woman was ready to serve her family, while a stained one meant she was already halfway through saving dinner. Patterns didn't match, pockets were frayed, but they were loved and never thrown away. It was the kind of clothing that said more about a household than any fancy outfit ever could. It represented love, labor, and the quiet strength of women who made everything from scratch. Every faded apron told the story of a family fed, a home kept, and a woman who never stopped moving. Plain wool coats with mended linings were the closest thing to luxury most poor families could manage during the cold winters of the 1960s. A good coat wasn't easy to come by, so when you had one, you made it last. The wool was heavy, often scratchy, but it kept the cold out. That was what mattered. Families bought them secondhand or inherited them from relatives, sometimes taking them apart and resewing them to fit the next person. Every winter brought new repairs: a fresh patch at the elbow, a new button found at the bottom of a sewing box, a stitch across the pocket that had split from overuse. The inside lining often looked like a map of life itself, full of old thread, tiny tears, and hidden love. The weight of the coat wasn't just from the wool, it was from the memories sewn deep within. Inside the pockets, you might find a scrap of fabric used as a patch, a safety pin holding a loose button, or a lining hand-stitched back in place by candlelight. These coats were worn for years, repaired endlessly, until the fabric itself began to thin. But even then, no one let go of them easily. They were too valuable, too full of memory. You didn't need a new coat every winter. You just needed one that could keep you warm. In their quiet, practical way, those mended coats were symbols of dignity that no price tag could replace. Flannel shirts with elbow patches were as common as cold mornings in the 1960s working-class home. Everyone had one or borrowed one from someone who did. Flannel was cheap, durable, and warm, perfect for men who worked outdoors or in drafty sheds. The sleeves eventually wore through, and that was when a mother or wife would sit down with needle and fabric to give them new life. The elbows never matched perfectly, but that didn't matter. The patches became badges of a hard day's living. The flannel softened over time, hugging shoulders shaped by labor and life. You could spot a man's favorite shirt by the way it hung, worn thin but never abandoned. The patches didn't match, but that was the point. They stood for the habit of fixing instead of throwing away. Each one carried a small act of love, a reminder that even the smallest repairs could hold a family together. They smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and soap, the quiet scent of a life built by hand. Those patched flannels weren't fashion. They were memory, stitched into every thread by the people who refused to give up on what they had. Simple cotton housecoats were the daily armor of women in poor households across the 1960s. They were easy to wash, light enough for summer chores, and sturdy enough to last through years of wear. Most women had only one or two, often sewn by hand or bought cheap at the local dime store. They were the kind of clothes you lived in, worn from morning coffee to late-night laundry. The fabric faded over time, but the comfort stayed. Pockets were deep for holding clothespins, recipes, or small toys, and every button told a story of repairs done in the quiet after everyone else had gone to bed. It wasn't stylish, but it was freedom. Freedom to move, work, and care without worrying about ruining something nice. Those housecoats were never seen on magazine covers, but in kitchens and porches across America, they were worn by women who kept entire families running on grit and grace. Thrift store Sunday suits were the working man's chance to look respectable, even when his wallet said otherwise. In the 1960s, church was more than worship. It was the one day a week when everyone tried to look their best, no matter how rough things were. You might not have had much, but on Sunday you stood a little taller in that worn suit that smelled faintly of mothballs and starch. Most of these suits came from donation boxes or secondhand stores, often a little too long in the sleeve or tight around the shoulders, but no one complained. Mothers would let out hems, replace buttons, and brush the fabric until it looked nearly new, performing small miracles with needle and thread to stretch one suit across years. A hand-me-down tie or polished shoes completed the look, and even if the lining was frayed, you walked into church with pride. It wasn't about wealth. It was about dignity, the sense that you still belonged somewhere, no matter your bank account. After service, those suits were carefully hung up again, ready for the next Sunday, or maybe a wedding or funeral. They weren't just clothes. They were symbols of hope and perseverance. For poor families, a clean suit wasn't a luxury. It was proof that pride could survive poverty. Homemade plaid skirts were the quiet rebellion against expensive store-bought fashion. For many young girls in the 1960s, their mothers or grandmothers stitched each pleat and seam by hand, often using leftover fabric or discount remnants from the local shop. These skirts were practical yet charming, built to last through countless school days and church picnics. The patterns rarely matched perfectly, but that only made them more personal. You could always tell which ones were homemade by the uneven plaid lines, but that was part of their beauty. Each one carried a sense of pride, proof that you didn't need money to look presentable or even stylish. When you wore one, you were wrapped in the quiet confidence that love and patience could outlast anything store-bought. Each skirt carried a mother's touch, with mismatched buttons and hidden repairs no one else could see. They were made to grow with the wearer, waistbands adjustable, hems ready to be let out when another inch of height arrived. And while the magazines showed girls in polished outfits from Sears catalogs, The homemade skirt crowd wore their thrift with quiet pride. They twirled just as easily on the dance floor and held their own against the store-bought fashions. The girls who wore them didn't have much, but they learned something valuable early: that love and effort made any outfit worth more than a price tag. Worn leather work boots were the foundation of every working man's life in the 1960s. You could tell a man's story by the condition of his boots, the creases, the worn soles, the stubborn polish in the cracks. They weren't fashionable. They were functional, bought once and made to last as long as possible. They trudged through mud, sawdust, and rain, carrying men to factories, fields, and long shifts that never seemed to end. Sometimes they were resoled 3 or 4 times before being retired, patched at the toes with scraps of rubber or laced with whatever string could be found. Kids would watch their fathers rub oil into the cracked leather every Sunday night, preparing for another week of work. The smell of polish, sweat, and determination clung to those boots like a story that never stopped being written. The leather cracked, the laces frayed, and soles were often nailed or glued back on more times than you could count. A pair of good boots might be passed down from father to son, broken in by hard labor and the shape of a foot that had worked too many hours. There was pride in keeping them alive, oiled every Sunday night, dried by the stove, ready again by dawn. They were more than footwear. They were tools, partners in every job, and quiet witnesses to a man's determination. In those days, a good pair of boots meant you were prepared to keep going, no matter how long the road ahead. Patchwork quilted jackets were a burst of color in otherwise gray times. When fabric was scarce and store prices soared, women found beauty in what was left behind: old shirts, worn sheets, scraps of dresses long outgrown. These pieces came together like memories, stitched carefully into jackets that were as warm as they were meaningful. Each one was unique, pieced together by hand and filled with the quiet satisfaction of making something from nothing. Each square told a story. Maybe a father's old flannel, a baby's blanket, or a piece of a mother's apron from years past. They were more than clothing. They were wearable family history, reminders of how resourcefulness could turn necessity into art. Wearing one felt like carrying your whole household on your back, stitched with care, color, and memory. They carried history in every square: a swatch from a father's shirt, a patch from a child's old blanket, a reminder of someone's love or labor. No two jackets ever looked alike, but everyone told the same story: thrift, creativity, and survival wrapped in warmth. Even when the seams were uneven, they stood out in their honesty, far richer than anything sold in a store. People wore them to work, to school, to town, their colors bright against the dull backdrop of hard times. A patchwork jacket wasn't just clothing. It was a work of art made by hands that refused to give up on hope. Homemade pajamas were proof that even the poorest families could find comfort at the end of a long day. Money might have been scarce, but love was not, and that's what these pajamas were made from. Mothers cut patterns from old sheets, worn shirts, or leftover fabric scraps, sewing each piece by hand under the hum of a late-night lamp. The stitches weren't perfect, but they held strong. Children could always tell which pair was theirs by the fabric. One might have stripes, another faded flowers, or even a patch of old curtain mixed in. They were soft from so many washes, smelling faintly of soap and sunlight. You didn't realize it as a child, but those pajamas were some of the most heartfelt things your parents ever made. Some were mismatched, polka dots on stripes, checks beside florals. But the warmth didn't care about fashion. Children wore them until the cuffs frayed and the knees thinned, but no one complained. They were soft, familiar, and made by someone who cared enough to make sure you slept warm. They smelled faintly of detergent and home, of something simple and pure. These pajamas weren't bought from a store. They were sewn from devotion, one seam at a time, a small reminder that love always finds a way to keep you covered. Corduroy pants were a symbol of practicality in the 1960s, and if you were poor, they were a staple. Corduroy was durable, affordable, and forgiving, the perfect material for kids who played rough and parents who didn't have the money for replacements. The fabric's soft ridges were its signature, wearing down over years of use, but somehow never truly giving up. A good pair of corduroy pants might see you through multiple school years, patched at the knees and hemmed again as you grew. The sound of the swishing fabric was unmistakable, a whisper of childhood echoing down school hallways. They were warm enough for winter and tough enough for play, a rare mix of comfort and function. Even when the knees turned shiny or the seams began to fade, they stayed your best pair because they had seen you through everything. They came in earthy tones, brown, rust, forest green, colors that hid dirt well and matched everything you owned. Every swish of the fabric as you walked was a quiet anthem of resilience. Parents knew that corduroy meant fewer worries, one more thing off the long list of needs they couldn't quite afford. They weren't stylish, but they lasted, and that made them worth more than their humble price. For the families who wore them, corduroy wasn't just clothing, it was security woven into every line. Canvas work jackets were the armor of the American laborer. Sturdy, thick, and weatherproof, they were built to take a beating in the field, the factory, or the workshop. They smelled of oil and sawdust, lined with the wear of a man who couldn't afford to stop working. These jackets weren't about looks. They were about getting the job done day after day. Each stain told a story. A broken machine fixed, a long day in the rain, or a week's worth of overtime earned the hard way. The fabric stiffened and softened again over the years, molded to the man who wore it. For some, it became part of their identity, recognizable by touch alone. The canvas stiffened with use, softening only after years of sweat and labor. Inside the pockets, you might find a pencil stub, a nail, or the trace of a day's work well done. When the elbows wore through, a wife or mother patched them, ensuring the jacket would see another season. A good work jacket became almost a second skin, passed down or repaired until it finally gave out. It wasn't fancy, but it represented something far more important: the pride of an honest day's work. Handcrafted school dresses with Peter Pan collars were small miracles made from big effort. Every mother wanted her daughter to look neat for school, even if the family's budget said otherwise. These dresses, often made from patterns in magazines or borrowed from a neighbor, became the pride of every little girl's wardrobe. The collars were round and delicate, the hems perfectly measured, and the buttons mismatched but lovingly sewn. Some were made from recycled fabric, maybe an old curtain or an outgrown dress from an older sister. A mother's careful hand made sure it looked new again, pressing each seam flat and trimming every loose thread. When her daughter walked into school wearing it, she didn't just look presentable, she looked loved. They were sewn at kitchen tables, sometimes late into the night, with a mix of patience and quiet determination. When finished, they looked store-bought to anyone who didn't know better, and that was the point. Each dress was a mother's way of saying, "You belong, just like everyone else." They might have been simple, but they were worn with joy and confidence. For families with little, these dresses were proof that love could turn thread and fabric into something beautiful. Basic work shirts were the backbone of the American wardrobe in the 1960s. Sold cheap at hardware stores or general shops, they were plain, practical, and endlessly repairable. Men wore them to fields, construction sites, and mills, often 5 or 6 days in a row. The collars frayed, the sleeves rolled up, and the pockets carried everything from cigarettes to small tools. Every man had at least one that became his favorite, soft from years of washing, its faded color almost comforting. It wasn't about how it looked. It was about how it fit, the way it moved with the rhythm of hard work. Even when the buttons didn't match anymore, you still wore it, because it had earned its place right alongside you. When one tore, it wasn't tossed out. It was patched, washed, and worn again. The faded colors and stains became part of the shirt's story, an unspoken record of long hours and hard-earned pay. The fabric softened with every wash, becoming as familiar as the work it was built for. These shirts didn't make fashion statements, but they didn't have to. They were symbols of strength and utility, worn by men who took pride in their labor, no matter how humble. Secondhand wool sweaters were the hand-me-down heroes of the 1960s winter. They were scratchy, often stretched, and always slightly too big, but they kept you warm when heat was a luxury. Bought from thrift stores or passed along from neighbors, they came in every imaginable pattern: stripes, solids, cable knits, and hand-me-down hope. You didn't care if they matched your outfit. You cared that they worked. The smell of wool and mothballs clung to them no matter how much detergent you used, but that smell meant safety from the cold. Sometimes they were darned at the elbows, sometimes missing a button, but they never failed to do their job. Each sweater carried a bit of someone else's life in its threads, proof that nothing warm should ever go to waste. They might have been secondhand, but for the families who wore them, they felt like blessings passed down from one winter to the next. White canvas sneakers were the one thing every kid dreamed of having, even in homes where new shoes were a rare luxury. They were simple, affordable, and versatile. The kind of shoe that could carry you through school days, summer chores, and Saturday adventures. When you finally got a pair, usually from a discount bin or handed down from an older sibling, you wore them until they fell apart. The fabric stained easily, the soles wore thin, and by mid-year the laces were gray from dust and life. Mothers tried to scrub them white with soap, bleach, or even baking soda, drying them on porches in the sun like trophies of childhood. They might have looked a little rough around the edges, but they were yours, and that meant something. You could run faster, climb higher, and forget for a while that money was tight when you had those sneakers on your feet. They weren't about fashion. They were about freedom. Every scuff told a story: a baseball game gone wrong, a rain puddle you were told not to jump in, or a summer spent outdoors from sunrise to dark. When the rubber started to peel away, you patched it or taped it, because throwing them out wasn't an option. And even when they were far from white, they still made you feel unstoppable. Homemade sunbonnets and headscarves were more than accessories. They were necessities for families who worked and lived close to the land. In the heat of summer, when the fields shimmered under the sun, these simple coverings kept faces shaded and skin safe from burning. They were made from scraps of cotton, often the same fabric used for dresses or aprons, and each one was different. Some plain, some with bits of leftover ribbon or faded floral prints. They were stitched by hand, often by mothers who knew the rhythm of a needle as well as they knew the rhythm of work. The bonnets framed faces that spent their days tending gardens, hanging laundry, or watching children play in dusty yards. The headscarves, tied snugly under the chin, were both modest and practical, symbols of a life that didn't stop for comfort. They were worn until the ties frayed or the colors faded, then replaced by another made from whatever could be found. These weren't just pieces of fabric. They were part of the uniform of resilience, protecting those who did the hardest work with quiet strength. In photos from that era, you can still see them: bright patches of determination against the endless light of a summer day. Homemade Easter dresses were a tradition that turned thrift into beauty. Every spring, mothers and grandmothers would pull out the sewing machine, determined to make something special for the holiday. Even if money was tight, Easter meant a new dress, or at least one that looked new. The fabric might have been bought on sale or pulled from an old set of curtains, but the effort was all heart. Lace trims, ruffled hems, and pastel colors transformed scraps into something truly proud. Girls would spin in front of mirrors, watching their skirts flare, the stitches made by hands that wanted them to feel beautiful even when life was hard. Each dress was ironed crisp the night before church, a masterpiece created not with money, but with patience and care. It wasn't about keeping up with the neighbors. It was about giving your child a reason to smile. On Easter morning, those dresses caught the sunlight like something sacred. They were worn with hand-me-down shoes, sometimes too big, and hair tied up with whatever ribbon could be found. And though they might not have come from a store window to the families who made them, they were as precious as any designer gown. They were a reminder that joy doesn't need wealth, just love and thread. Cotton undershirts and long johns were the hidden heroes of the 1960s wardrobe. They were never meant to be seen, but they were the first line of defense against the cold. In homes without much heat, these thin layers made all the difference on long winter mornings. Worn by men, women, and children alike, they were washed until the fabric thinned and the seams stretched, yet still they endured. Mothers folded them neatly after each wash, their softness a comfort that money couldn't buy. The fabric clung tight, the way warmth clings to the body, offering small protection against the bite of the season. They were humble garments, plain, practical, and always taken for granted until the cold set in. In the hardest months, long johns were sometimes worn day and night, hidden under work clothes or pajamas. They weren't pretty, but they represented the small mercies of warmth and care. For families who couldn't afford new coats or fancy heating, those layers meant survival, quiet proof that even the simplest things could keep you going through the longest winter. Plain canvas belts and suspenders were the unspoken essentials of poor families in the 1960s, practical, sturdy, and built to last far longer than they were supposed to. You didn't replace them, you repaired them, tightening the holes or sewing the ends when they began to fray. These accessories weren't about style, they were about holding life together, literally. A good belt or pair of suspenders might last a man 20 years, worn daily with work pants and Sunday clothes alike. The canvas grew softer over time, stained with sweat, dust, and the rhythm of routine. Fathers adjusted them at dawn before long shifts, while sons borrowed them years later when it was their turn to face the same kind of work. They weren't decorative, they were dependable, a small but vital piece of clothing that kept everything else in its place. Suspenders often had mismatched clips or homemade replacements, reminders of resourcefulness when money was short. They might not have looked like much, but they were another symbol of endurance, proof that you didn't need fine leather to stand tall. In the quiet simplicity of those belts and suspenders lived a whole way of life, practical, honest, and built to last. If you were a kid in the 1980s, there were two ways to rebel. You could get grounded, or you could collect Garbage Pail Kids. What started as a gross-out parody of wholesome Cabbage Patch Kids quickly mutated into one of the most controversial and overstimulating franchises of the decade. The trading cards were wild enough, oozing noses, melting eyeballs, radioactive vomit. But that was just the beginning. Suddenly, they were everywhere. Garbage Pail Kids lunchboxes, bed sheets, pajamas, notebooks, puzzles, even Halloween costumes. It was like someone said, "What if childhood was more disgusting?" And the market responded, "Yes, please." Parents hated them, teachers banned them, some schools even confiscated them on site. But for kids, they were pure rebellion in sticker form. Every new pack was a gamble. Would you get Atom Bomb or Leaky Lindsay? Either way, it was peak 1980s absurdity, but the brand overdid it. What once felt underground became overexposed, and by the time the infamous Garbage Pail Kids movie dropped in theaters, it was game over. Gross became exhausting. The merch wave collapsed under its own snot-covered weight. Still, it was fun while it lasted. Now, let us talk about another trend that looked sweet and innocent, until summer arrived and your feet begged for mercy. They were weird. That was everyone's first thought. Foam platform flip-flops looked like someone glued a shower sponge to a sandal and called it fashion. But once you tried them on, something clicked, literally and emotionally. The soft, bouncy soles made every step feel like you were walking on marshmallows. Suddenly, you were 2 inches taller and twice as confident. And for many, that was enough. At first, they were beachwear, an odd novelty you picked up on vacation and wore as a joke. But then summer came around, and people started wearing them. Everywhere. To school, to the mall, to concerts, the foam base had just enough squish to feel like rebellion, just enough weird to make you stand out. And that mattered. Everyone wanted to be taller without looking like they tried. Everyone wanted comfort without giving up edge. These flip-flops were not exactly safe. They wobbled, they tipped, they tripped you up sometimes. But that was part of the charm. They were unstable in all the ways the 1970s were, loud, strange, somehow graceful. And if you managed to master the art of walking in them, you earned more than height, you earned style points. Jello molds were not just recipes, they were performances. In the 1950s and 1960s, these shimmering towers of gelatin were the pride of dinner tables and potlucks alike. Suspended inside were slices of fruit, vegetables, nuts, and sometimes even meats, frozen in mid-dance by the wobble of lemon or lime gelatin. The molds themselves were often metal, shaped like flowers, domes, or decorative rings. Housewives practiced their releases with reverence, praying the mold would slide out cleanly with a satisfying thwack. The result? A glossy, surreal centerpiece. Guests gasped, children poked. Recipes were passed from neighbor to neighbor, each claiming their version was best. But these creations were not just about looks. Jello was cheap, shelf-stable, and forgiving. It let families stretch their ingredients during lean times. It made leftovers glamorous, and it brought a little joy to a time when people needed something bright and strange and wonderful. Eventually, tastes changed. Molds disappeared into cabinets. Jello became a snack cup. But for decades, it was art, it was pride, and it was love in a ring-shaped dish. When did we stop celebrating the food that made us smile before it ever touched our lips? Slap bracelets were the toy that hit your wrist and hit peak popularity, almost overnight. They were simple. A metal strip wrapped in colorful fabric that snapped around your arm with one satisfying motion. One moment it was straight, the next it curled tight, clinging to your wrist like a coiled snake. Every kid had one. Some had dozens, trading them like currency during recess. They came in neon colors, animal prints, sparkles, and cartoon characters. The louder the snap, the better. Some kids got so good they could slap them onto their arms without looking. But with popularity came problems. Schools started banning them. Parents worried about the metal underneath. Rumors flew about kids cutting themselves open with a rogue bracelet that had been peeled apart. That only made them cooler. Everyone wanted the forbidden accessory. Teachers tried to confiscate them, but they always found their way back into backpacks and onto arms. Slap bracelets were fun, fast, and a little dangerous, just enough to feel rebellious. They were not just toys. They were fashion statements, fidget tools, and tiny thrills rolled into one. And even now, the sound of that sharp snap is enough to take you right back to 4th grade. The mini boombox was supposed to be the coolest thing you could clip onto your belt. A pint-sized party machine, a radio revolution in your pocket. But in reality, it was all look, no boom. These things were everywhere in the late 1980s, bright, plastic, and usually in neon colors that matched your windbreaker. They were meant to let you carry your music wherever you went, like a portable dance party. Except the sound quality was trash. The volume was barely louder than a whisper. If you were outside, forget it. Wind was louder. And the tape deck? Constantly ate your favorite cassette, if it even had a tape deck. A lot of them were just FM radios disguised as full-function players. But hey, they looked cool. They had fake speakers, shiny knobs, and some even had stickers that made them look high-tech. You could strut down the sidewalk, mini boombox on your hip, headphones plugged in, until the batteries died an hour later. And that was the end of that. So yes, it flopped. But it flopped with style. And if you thought that was noisy, wait until we revisit the school supply that became an auditory menace in classrooms across America. The Velcro symphony known as the Trapper Keeper. Imagine walking down the sidewalk, holding a stiff leash, talking to it like it was the best dog in the world. Except there was no dog. That was the entire point. Invisible dog leashes were one of the most bizarre gags to come out of the 1970s, and also one of the most strangely brilliant. The leash had a rigid wire inside, shaped to suggest the motion of a small dog, but without any actual pet. To the untrained eye, it looked like magic, or madness. People would stop, point, ask questions, laugh. And that was the whole joy of it. It was humor in motion. But the leash also did something deeper. It exposed how much we rely on visuals to accept what we see. Without a dog, it was just absurd. But with your confident strut and casual chatter, you sold the illusion. At first, adults rolled their eyes and called it nonsense. But the kids, they got it instantly. They turned sidewalks into stages and strangers into audiences. And what started as a joke soon became a form of expression, a way to bring a little silliness into a world that often took itself too seriously. The invisible dog leash was never just a toy. It was a statement, a reminder that not everything has to be real to make people smile. The Teasmade was not just a novelty. It was a revolution in how mornings began. A combination alarm clock and tea maker, it became a fixture in British bedrooms and a curious but beloved import in mid-century American homes. Imagine waking to the gentle hiss of boiling water, the soft clink of porcelain, and the smell of fresh brewed tea wafting through the air before your feet ever touched the floor. The Teasmade delivered this magic through simple but elegant engineering. A timer triggered the kettle. A mechanical arm poured the boiling water into a waiting teacup. No fumbling in the kitchen, no slamming drawers, just warmth and calm. Some models even included a gentle nightlight, glowing softly on your bedside table like a companion. It turned mornings into rituals. But rituals are easy to break. Coffee took over. Digital clocks became the norm. And the quiet grace of the Teasmade was forgotten. Now it exists mostly in memories and dusty attics. But for those who used one, the association is immediate. Peace, intention. A morning that cared for you instead of demanded something from you. When did we trade thoughtful awakenings for jarring alarms and paper cups? Mall food court hangouts were not about the food, they were about freedom. Teenagers in the 1980s treated the mall like their second home, wandering its air-conditioned halls with nothing but pocket change and big plans to do absolutely nothing. The food court was the epicenter. Tables filled with cliques, couples, and groups of giggling friends stretched out time between slices of greasy pizza and soft pretzels. One soda could last hours, especially when refills were free. You scoped out crushes, eavesdropped on drama, and occasionally made eye contact with someone cool enough to nod back. Parents dropped you off and picked you up hours later, trusting the mall to act like a babysitter with bright lights and security guards. Whether you sat near the arcade or tucked into the corner by Orange Julius, the food court was a social stage. It was loud, it was messy, and it felt like your world. Every weekend brought the same faces, the same greasy trays, and the same comforting rhythm of adolescent independence. No one talked about it like it was special. But for those who grew up there, it was the perfect mix of noise, neon, and growing up in public. You knew a kid was cool if their necklace made noise from down the hallway. Enter the plastic charm necklace. These things were a fashion statement and a choking hazard all rolled into one. A long, brightly colored chain that you decked out with dozens of plastic trinkets. Mini roller skates, tiny telephones, hair dryers, soda bottles, and anything else the size of your thumb. The more charms, the better. It was like curating your own loud, clunky resume of childhood interests. Everyone traded them. Everyone bragged about having the rare ones. And of course, the plastic was cheap enough to snap if you breathed on it wrong. Teachers hated them. Parents hated stepping on them. But kids loved how collectible they felt. That is, until the day you leaned over your desk and your entire charm empire dumped itself on the floor like a sad little toy avalanche. Still, for a while, they were the perfect combination of fashion and fun. And speaking of things that looked fun but failed to function properly, do you remember the sweet-smelling school supply that never actually worked? Let us talk about rubber-scented erasers shaped like food. They looked ridiculous. That is what adults said anyway. Bright rainbow stripes that screamed attention, weird plastic clips, and a design straight out of some alien costume party. But in the late 1970s, everyone who mattered, by that we mean kids and teenagers, wanted one thing dangling from their shoulders. Mork from Orc suspenders. Inspired by Robin Williams' breakout role in Mork and Mindy, these suspenders became the loudest badge of cool you could own. You did not even have to watch the show. You just had to see someone at school bouncing down the hall wearing a pair, laughing too loudly and acting a little weird. And you knew. You wanted that feeling. At first, even fans hesitated. Suspenders were something your grandfather wore with a tired suit and sagging socks. They were old, outdated, but add a splash of rainbow and the energy of an alien from the planet Ork, and suddenly they felt like rebellion. They felt like freedom. Everyone from middle school rebels to teenage pranksters latched onto the trend. It was not about fashion. It was about being loud without saying a word. You wore those suspenders like a warning label. This person does not play by the rules. And eventually, even the doubters wanted in. Because if Mork could wear them and win hearts across the galaxy, maybe you could wear them and win the lunchroom. The Coldspot refrigerator was not just an appliance. It was the promise of a modern American life, humming quietly behind a steel door. Born in 1928 and sold by Sears for nearly 50 years, it was as dependable as it was beautiful. But in 1935, the Coldspot became something extraordinary. That year, legendary designer Raymond Loewy transformed it into a sleek, curved monument to the future. Gone were the clunky bolts and exposed hinges. In their place, smooth lines, minimal handles, and a shape that looked more like a Cadillac fender than a food locker. It was the first refrigerator to look good in the spotlight, not just behind the scenes. Inside, it had adjustable shelves, crisper drawers, and butter compartments, all luxuries at the time. It was quiet, reliable, and built to last for decades. Families placed cherished leftovers in its embrace. Birthday cakes, cold fried chicken, pitchers of lemonade. This was where comfort lived. And yet, the Coldspot's legacy faded as mass manufacturing favored cheaper materials and disposable models. The beauty disappeared. The silence was replaced with buzz and blinking lights, and the promise of forever was swapped for one-year warranties. When did we decide that cold convenience was more important than warm design? Payphone predicaments were a daily part of life before everyone had a phone in their pocket. You needed a quarter, maybe two, and a working booth to make a call. No signal bars, no group texts, just a heavy receiver, a scratchy dial tone, and sometimes a sticky keypad. Finding a payphone that was not broken or graffitied felt like a small miracle. If you were lucky, it worked on the first try. If not, you banged the receiver, tried again, and hoped your coins did not disappear into the void. Making a collect call meant saying your name faster than humanly possible. "Hello, mother, please pick me up right now," before the machine cut you off. Privacy was non-existent. Everyone could hear your conversation. Rain? You ducked into the booth and hoped it did not smell like sadness and cigarette smoke. Nighttime? Good luck. The glow of the payphone sign was a lonely beacon, but it was all we had. We memorized numbers. We waited in line. We scrounged for change in pockets and glove compartments, and when the call finally went through, it felt like a victory. Payphones were clunky, inconvenient, and unreliable. But they were also our lifeline, one quarter at a time. Before cell phones, there were landlines. And before minimalism, there were designer phone covers. And boy, did the 1980s go all in. You could not just have a phone, you had to dress it. We are talking fur-lined receivers, leopard print handsets, and rhinestone-covered cradles. Nothing screamed glamour like trying to have a conversation with what looked like a bedazzled chinchilla pressed against your ear. There was even one that looked like a hamburger. Why? No one really knows. But the 1980s were not about asking why. They were about asking, does this come in glitter pink? People wanted their rotary phones to match their shag carpet and floral wallpaper, and these accessories delivered poorly. The covers fell apart. They muffled the sound. And let us be honest, no emergency call was improved by digging through a layer of sequins. It turned something simple into a full-time job. You had to prepare to use your phone. The trend eventually fizzled out, mostly because the novelty wore off and the practicality never existed in the first place. Still, the 1980s loved their flair, especially when you could wear it, like, say, around your neck in the most jingly way possible. There was a moment in the 1970s when you could walk into a party and see a couple wearing the exact same outfit, and somehow it worked. That was unisex fashion, a bold, strange, often mocked movement that blurred the lines between his and hers, and replaced them with one loud, patterned, stretchy ours. At first, people hated it. Men in bell-sleeved shirts and wide-legged pants, women in tailored vests and matching blazers. It was confusing. It was risky, but it was also exactly what the 1970s needed. This was a time of rebellion, against war, against inequality, against the boring predictability of the decades before. Clothes were no longer just fabric, they were statements. And unisex fashion was a declaration that people could dress however they wanted and love whoever they wanted, without rules. Matching jumpsuits, his and hers flare jeans, bold stripes, earthy tones, and silky fabrics. At its peak, unisex fashion made you look twice, not just at the outfit, but at the people wearing them. It made you ask questions. And sometimes, that discomfort turned into understanding. What started as a joke in some circles turned into a quiet revolution. Fashion was never just about looking good, it was about saying something. And in the 1970s, unisex fashion spoke loud and clear. The electric egg poacher was the quiet champion of a better breakfast. Small, unassuming, and often overlooked, it sat tucked away in the corners of countertops, promising soft whites and warm yolks without a pot or pan in sight. You filled the base with water, cracked your eggs into the holders, and watched the steam rise slowly into a gentle cloud. It was perfect for those who wanted elegance without the effort. No vinegar, no swirling water, no chance of a ruined yolk. Just press the button and walk away. In a world full of toasters and coffee makers, it whispered, "Take your time." It belonged to the kind of home that played soft jazz on Sunday mornings and served breakfast on ceramic plates instead of paper towels. The poacher did not need to be flashy. It was consistent. It gave people back their mornings. And yet, it faded. Because poached eggs stopped being everyday meals. Because we forgot how nice it was to feel fancy before 9 in the morning. Now, most sit in thrift shops, unused and unappreciated. But for those who remember, one bite of that perfectly poached egg takes them straight back. When did we decide breakfast was no longer worth slowing down for? Atari gaming sessions were pixelated magic. You plugged in a cartridge, gripped a joystick, and entered a world made of blinking squares and bleeping sounds. The graphics were basic, the controls were stiff, and yet you were hooked. Pong, Frogger, Space Invaders. Each game was a challenge, a test of reflexes and patience. You played alone, with friends, or against your sibling for hours. The television hummed, the screen flickered, the joystick squeaked under the weight of your determination. Games froze, scores reset, but the fun never stopped. Atari brought the arcade home, turning dens and basements into battlegrounds of bragging rights. There were no saves, no checkpoints, just you and your ability to last longer than your last game. Every win felt epic, every loss felt personal. And if the cartridge did not load, you took it out, blew into it like a sacred ritual, and tried again. Atari gaming was simple, frustrating, and unforgettable. It was not about the graphics, it was about the experience. And for those who held that joystick and battled blinking enemies, those early games are etched in memory. Proof that sometimes a bouncing square was all it took to feel like a hero. There are hairstyles, and then there are structural engineering projects. Gravity-defying bangs, held aloft by industrial-strength hairspray, were the crown jewels of 1980s style. We are talking sky-high, shellacked to perfection, immovable bangs that could survive a hurricane. You did not just style your hair, you sculpted it. And the glue that held it all together? A can of Aquanet, the unofficial perfume of the decade. One spritz was never enough. You held that button down until the room filled with fog and your lungs begged for mercy. It was how you knew your bangs were officially done. They had to crunch when you tapped them. These bangs had volume, attitude, and possibly their own zip code. They required teasing, patience, and a total disregard for the ozone layer. Parents disapproved. Schools banned combs in lockers. But if your bangs did not touch the ceiling of your school photo backdrop, were you even living? It was extreme. It was ridiculous. And it was glorious. But eventually, the sky-high trend lost steam, and pastel blazers tried to take over the fashion throne. Spoiler alert, not everyone could pull off Crockett from Miami Vice. The first time someone saw a beanbag chair, they probably thought it was a deflated pillow with no purpose. No back support, no legs, no structure. Just a blob of squishy fabric filled with tiny beads, sitting there like a mistake someone forgot to throw out. But then, someone sat in it, and everything changed. Beanbag chairs did not care about proper posture or furniture rules. They molded to you. They embraced you like a soft, shapeless hug that said, "You do not have to sit like an adult right now." Kids loved them. Teenagers made them their throne. College dorm rooms practically built their entire identities around them. You could throw one into a corner, and suddenly it was the coolest seat in the house. And that was the thing. What seemed lazy and sloppy turned out to be genius. It was comfort without apology, a rebellion against stiff couches and uptight dinner chairs. Beanbag chairs became the symbol of do your own thing in a decade that desperately needed that message. The 1970s were messy, unpredictable, and loud. And so were these chairs. They belonged. They fit right in. And even if adults scoffed at them, they eventually sat down. And once they did, they stayed. The hand crank egg beater was a rite of passage. Long before mixers plugged into walls, children stood on stools beside their mothers, gripping the cool metal handle and turning the crank with both hands. The beaters would spin in a blur, blending sugar, eggs, and flour into the thick beginnings of birthday cakes and pancake batter. It was not efficient, but it was intimate. You felt the recipe coming together. Your arms grew sore, but your heart grew full. The egg beater did not make noise. It did not break. It did not ask for anything but effort. Every kitchen had one, usually tucked in a drawer next to the wooden spoons and measuring cups. Its clinking metal gears were as familiar as the smell of vanilla extract. And somehow, everything tasted better when it had been beaten by hand. Then came stand mixers, food processors, and digital timers. The crank beater was cast aside as outdated, inconvenient, old. But in that loss, something human disappeared. Now it hangs on antique shop walls, a symbol of effort, patience, and care. It taught us that food was not just made, it was earned. Why did we stop believing that some things are better when you feel them in your bones? Scratch and sniff stickers made notebooks smell like fruit salad, or something pretending to be. Grape, banana, pizza, popcorn, if it existed, there was probably a sticker that gave off a chemical approximation of it. These tiny scented rewards were currency on the playground. You earned them from teachers, you traded them with friends. You collected them in sticker books and flipped through your favorites like a sommelier of glue and artificial scent. Some smelled better than others. Some were so strong they made your eyes water. Others lost their smell after a few scratches but were kept anyway, honored like faded trophies. You knew the popular ones: root beer, bubble gum, and anything with glitter. You also knew the duds, like liverwurst or mystery meat, that somehow ended up in your binder anyway. Scratching a sticker in class was a quiet act of rebellion. You were not supposed to, but you did. And then you passed the notebook around so others could sniff and nod in approval, or gag in horror. Scratch and sniff stickers were low-tech fun with high nostalgic value. They turned paper into treasure. And even today, one whiff of fake strawberry is enough to transport you straight back to third grade with a smile. The 1980s were not just colorful, they were textured. Enter puffy paint clothing projects where kids became designers and your closet turned into a craft aisle. You would grab an oversized sweatshirt, some neon puffy paint, and go to town. Maybe your name in bubble letters. Maybe a dolphin jumping over a rainbow. Maybe just abstract blobs of color that looked like a melted ice cream truck. The point was not perfection. It was personality. These paints dried thick and rubbery, forming crusty shapes that cracked after one wash. And forget drying time. You had to leave that sweatshirt on a hanger for a day, hoping no one touched it and left fingerprints in the masterpiece. Once dry, you wore it proudly, to school, to the mall, to family dinner. But comfort? Out the window. the back of the paint rubbed against your skin like sandpaper. Heaven forbid someone hugged you. You would both end up glittery. Still, it was a rite of creative passage. You were a walking art exhibit whether you liked it or not. But if you thought your sweatshirt was stiff, wait until you remember the home appliance that tried to combine two technologies and ended up giving you the worst of both worlds. If these clothes brought back memories of patched knees, hand-sewn hems, or the pride of making do with what you had, share your favorite in the comments. Press that like button to keep the thread going, and subscribe for more stories stitched straight from America's past.